Welcome to the Saturday Salon, a podcast that has been going for more than 6 years and is an informal podcast for the young global leaders. But today we have chosen to open it up for all to benefit from the learnings. So, I know, at least I have been asking myself this question a lot. What would it take to make work something that we can remain excited about for the next 50 or 60 years? We're all discussing longevity. We're going to live very long life, but what does it actually mean for our work life and overall well-being? You probably have seen it. There's a new book out called Living the 100 Years Life. And exactly that question is being the center course of this conversation today. My guest today is Professor Lynda Gratton, Professor of Management Practice at London Business School, and one of the world's leading thinkers in the future of work, longevity, and organizational life. And plainly put, if you ask me, one of the most iconic women in academia and business. She's authored more than 11 books and so many articles across all the platforms and favorite magazines that you probably have studied and read throughout your life. And she works with companies and governments, and she has researched how longer lives and new technologies, especially AI at the moment, of course, and changing social expectations are reshaping not only our careers, but also our identities, relationships, and sense of purpose. Her work is to ask and answer all the questions that we have, what it means to live a fulfilling and exciting work life and life. So if many of us are going to live until we're 100 or even more, well, then we're going to work probably long into our 70s. So today's conversation is very important to have a great conversation about this. Lynda, welcome so much. And
Thank you.
You're tuning in, but not from UK, which I would expect, but you're actually in France. What are you doing in France?
Well, every August I decamp to France. We have a house here, and that's actually where I do all my thinking, all my writing. In fact, my new book, Living the 100-Year Life, starts with a story of me walking in France and actually thinking that my dad was already dead so long before me and how precious these extra years are. But of course, as young global leaders, hello, I know I've met many of you over the years. Of course, you're going to live to 100. You're young global leaders. You're going to live to at least 100. You'll use blood from your children, that sort of thing.
I hope not, but probably, yeah, there's a lot.
I've got one of my grandchildren here, but I haven't taken any of her blood. You'll be glad to know.
I appreciate that at least. But, I've been following your work for years and you don't age. So maybe there's something to it, Lynda. I don't know what your secret is. So you're in France. I mean, let's talk about France for a second. I understand why you're inspired there. There's the sun, good food, busyness, but also a lot of relaxation. Do you think that life quality matters more than we like to discuss?
Well, I'd actually started writing this book 4 years ago here in France. And I began really, because I didn't really want to write another business book. As you've said, I've written 11 books. My last one, Redesigning Work, was about the pandemic and all the things that happened. I wanted to do something different. So I started off spending 1 year actually just writing stories of my life. And then I began to bring them back together again. And the question I kept returning to, which is, the question you opened with, is in the 100-Year Life, Andrew Scott and I had shown the economics of how many of us will live into our hundreds. We'll be working into our 70s, perhaps later. And many of us would probably enjoy doing that. And so for me, the real issue was, how do you do that? And so I brought all these stories together, plus, my programs I've run at London Business School, the executives I've spoken to, and I came up with this idea of that we weave a life. And, to your question, what is it about quality of life? What I realized when we weave a life, every single day we're weaving our lives, there are threads, some of which are about being productive and some of which are about being nurturing ourselves, nurturing others. And I do think that combination of staying productive, which means that you can work into right the way through your life if you stay productive, but also if you also nurture yourself and the others around you, that's just a marvelous combination. So as we weave our lives, what we're trying to achieve is not so much balance between being productive and nurturing ourselves, but rather an understanding of where we are. And that's why in the book, the opening questions, I call these the guiding questions, are: who am I? where am I now, and what actions should I take now, and what promises should I make to my future self.
Do you think that we spend too little time to do that inventory of our own life during our work life?
Yes, absolutely. The thing is that if you think about your parents' career or maybe your grandparents' career, they thought about that as a ladder, and you walked up, and you're all very familiar, young global leaders, you're all very familiar getting up the ladder. But actually, that metaphor isn't really working so much, because the ladder assumes that there's only one way up. The ladder assumes that everybody else is doing it with you, so you don't really have to think for yourself. And I think what we're now realizing is being on autopilot just isn't going to work for us. When you're running up a ladder, you're sort of on autopilot. What do I do next? But actually, the sort of lives that we're living where AI is transforming. We're living longer in a time of huge technological reinvention and also social change. We have to have much more sort of personal agency. And to have personal agency, we need to give ourselves time, both individually and collectively, to reflect, to think. And interestingly, I've just finished a 10-week program with 3 organizations and executives within it, thinking about living the 100-year life. And what was really sort of fascinating, listening to them over that period, it was a virtual program, was just how much they appreciated the opportunity both to reflect but also to talk to each other about, how do I do this? How do I make this work? So I absolutely agree with you that we've got to put time in to be reflective.
Well, Lynda, there's so much to dive into here. I've watched some of your interviews as preparation of this interview today, and you do ask us to question the fundamentals in how we approach work life. There's a traditional 3-stage life: expectation and education, work and retirement. And you say, no. I mean, you touched upon it now. It's not a ladder. It's maybe more like a dance, right? We have to figure this out. But what do you mean? Should I take a break? I mean, I'm 50 now. Should I take a sabbatical 1 year, 2 years, and now recalibrate myself? Should we be more open? I think is a guiding question.
Yes, of course.
What do you think about that?
I mean, the marvelous thing about the weave is that you can weave your life in any way you want, with any pattern you want. The pattern that you're building, that you're weaving, is not the same as my pattern. And so as we weave our pattern, we can think about, how do we want our life to look? Now, as you mentioned, the 3-stage life of full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement actually worked really well, because it meant we all were in it together. We walked through it at the same time. It created the timetable. In fact, I've written a couple of hbr.org pieces in the last week or two, which do have a look at that, which really helps you think a little bit more about what happens when that timetable goes. And when the timetable goes, then you've got, I think, the 3 patterns emerge. And in fact, most of us are building a mix between them. The first is the 3-stage life, which is still a pattern. I mean, education, work, retirement, that lateral. Some of you may still, perhaps you're in finance, or like my son, and he's a medic. He's probably going to live that life. So that life hasn't disappeared. But there's 2 other alternatives. One is, the multi-stage life, where you say, as you're saying, look, rather than full-time education and full-time retirement at the ends, why don't I take some of that education and sprinkle it through my life? And why don't I take some of the retirement and sprinkle that through, rather than having, retiring at 60 and dying at 100 and having all that time to retire? Why don't I, as you're saying, take a little bit of it and move it back and have a sabbatical, have a break, think about starting my own business? Remember, for young global leaders, the most auspicious time to start a business is the age of 42. So there's always plenty of time to start your own business, to become a freelancer. I wrote that wonderful article, Harvard Business Review article with Diane Gerson, about freelancers and just how important they're becoming. So there's the multi-stage where you do one of these at a time. But there's also the portfolio, where you're trying to do quite a lot of things at the same time. And my life is a portfolio right now, because I have a position at London Business School. I'm a professor there, but I also have my own consulting practice. And I also spend a lot of time encouraging people, to live the 100-year life. So that's very much a portfolio. And interestingly, when I asked my MBA students a couple of years ago, how many of you want to build a portfolio? Pretty much everybody put their hand up. And I said, okay, I guess you're going to do that when you're in your 60s. And they said, no, we want to do it about now. So I think each of those patterns are available to us. They each have benefits and challenges. So, for example, I know you're thinking, well, if I took a sabbatical for 6 months, would I be able to get back in? Would I be penalized? And these are all perfectly reasonable questions. And of course, organizations also have to change to realize that people are no longer doing that, up the career ladder.
Actually, that was my next question. What must companies change? Because when you upload your resume, Lynda, or when you meet with a headhunter, it's probably software that's going to read your application, at least the first one. And are those software applications, are they trained to actually acknowledge, what would I say, a not so traditional path?
That's such a good question. What we know is that AI is trained on the past. That's it. So they're large learning models. They're not creative, they're learning models, and they're learning from the past. So the past was very much made it hard to, to get a new job over the age of 50. And we know this, the data is really clear on that if you apply for a job over the age of 50, it's going to be hard for you even to get to the first interview. And that's such a mistake. I was just talking to my brother yesterday who's has a license for pickleball in the UK. And he said, my God, I've just found this amazing person. And they used to be at Tesco's and they're 52 years old and they're dying to help me. And I've taken them on as head of marketing. And he said, he brings so much experience. And that's the sort of idea we want. We want to realize that people at 50, 60, at 70, even at 80 have so much experience. But that means that we have to prepare for that right through our lives. That living the 100-year life isn't about what you do in the last 10 years of your life. It's about what you do right the way through your life. It's the weave that starts at the very beginning. And so it is hard. And I want to acknowledge that. I don't want to suggest that organizations are saying, oh, isn't it great? We want all these people over 50. They're not. But they are beginning to change. There's a long history of individuals wanting to change and organizations being very slow. We wrote about it in a couple of books. And so don't be surprised if organizations are still a bit slow, but they will change. It may just take a bit of time.
As you know, I'm a venture-backed tech founder in Silicon Valley, and I'm spending my time between Europe and US. And one of the things that I am witnessing is that I might be biased because I'm in Palo Alto, right? I understand that's the heart of Silicon Valley, and the mindset there might not be representative of many other places. But somehow in Palo Alto and Silicon Valley, age, gender, educational background, all of those things don't matter as long as you have the energy and stamina and curiosity to keep learning. And if you are a founder, you're almost at the highest of the hierarchy in that area. People adore you for taking the risk of starting something. And then you know where I'm going, because when I look in Denmark, where I also grew up and I also have my dear family and I have a home in Copenhagen, it's very opposite. If you are a founder and you walk into a room, I'm saying this relatively, it's a cliche almost, but I do feel you're almost at the bottom of your hierarchy, right? Because at the top, you are a chairperson, a CEO of a large corporate. You know what I mean? So
yes.
So do you given your background and everything you research, does it matter where you are physically? Even in times now with hybrid, because you're huge on hybrid work also and an expert on that. So I was just curious if there's something happening there that is going to free up the boundaries.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Well, I'm sitting here in France where, the retirement age is very low, and it's sort of crazy actually, because A, it's way too low. It encourages people to leave work far too early. And B, it's an enormous economic burden on the state to be paying people to retire when actually they they probably want and could carry on working. So you're absolutely right. Across the world, there are differences. Well, in a place like Silicon Valley or like New York, or maybe Tokyo and possibly Seoul, what people are really interested in is your skills and your experience and your wisdom. And that's just a wonderful. I'm very fortunate because I'm in an industry which is not particularly ageist. The fact that no one's ever said to me, when you're going to retire, when you're going to leave, that's been a really wonderful thing for me, actually. And so I agree with you that there are places where you're probably going to feel much more, as you're doing in Copenhagen, thinking I don't really fit here very well. But, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that the productivity threads, and there's 4 of them. The first is mastery, which is, how do you really build something that you're really good at, that people want to buy, that brings you value. The second is knowing, which is a sort of wisdom that you build, and curiosity, as you mentioned earlier. The third then is cooperating, because so much of what we do, you do with other people. And then the fourth is amplification, which is how you use AI to amplify yourself. If you keep those threads strong and really invest in them, then you're going to be in a much better position to pick up work, to do things. Because as you say, you're sitting here in Copenhagen right now, but you're able to work in Palo Alto. I'm sitting here in France right now, and I've had already, meetings with Tokyo and with Australia in the last 2 days. So the virtual nature of our world does make it so much easier for us to demonstrate our skills wherever we happen to be living. So I totally agree that probably I hadn't made this connection. Thank you for making this. It's a great connection between being virtual and having more of a chance to shine at every age.
I like that. Yeah. Thank you, Lynda, for that. You do, I'm sure that you have already been asked quite a lot, given that you are an expert on future of work, or work as such, period, organizational work. How does artificial intelligence impact, you think, the next 3-4 years? And let me add something. I'm part of the Future Council for the World Economic Forum. I'm one of 20 leaders that are advising the WEF on future of AI and sustainability and finance, moral economy to be specific. Anyway, long story short, I sit in those rooms where executives from Fortune 500 are giving their thoughts on how unemployment rates or what positions are going to disappear or re-emerge or being redesigned and so forth for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Given your global perspective and with everything you've been through already in your life and all the trends and tendencies that you've been witnessing and studied, what do you think is going to happen for the next 3, 4, 5 years? We're just guessing, I'm sure, but you know how to read the trends. So what are you thinking?
Well, let me just say a couple of things about that. Firstly, as I mentioned with the book, there's 8 threads, 4 about productivity, 4 about nurture. Amplification is one of those threads, and it would certainly not have been there 10 years ago. So you're absolutely right to say that we now have in our life a thread which is about amplification. So, for example, somebody like me who's a skilled expert, or somebody like you, or many of the people listening today, we know right now, that when we use AI, we become 6 times more productive. 6 times. Now, that's not true for younger people. And there's a whole issue about how younger people learn. And I've talked about that. I did a HBR article on that, how do you learn in a time of AI? But leaving that aside for a moment. So it's very clear that AI will change the way that we work. It's taking out some of the tasks we do. And it's making it more difficult for young people to learn, because people learn through feedback and, doing something over and over again. And that's what mastery is. So clearly that's going to be an issue. But I do think we've all got to really consider the benefits of AI. And that's why I think the amplification thread is so important. And what I would say about that is each one of us has to practice and use AI and think about how we're using it. But here's something I would really ask each of you to consider, and it's this. When AI makes you 6 times more productive, what do you do with the extra time? Do you, A, just do much more work, or B, do you put some of your energy into your other threads? Your nurture threads, for example. So, for example, do you spend a bit of time with people you love? Do you, and that's about intimacy, the thread of intimacy, the thread of friendship. Do you phone up a friend for 8 minutes to find out what she or he is up to? Do you, and this is the thread of calm, do you spend a bit of time just relaxing, meditating, walking, swimming, whatever you do? Or do you, and this is the thread of adventure, do something really exciting? Because if all you're doing as you're increasing your productivity is doing more of the same, you are not strengthening all of your threads. So that would be what I would say. In terms of the future, honestly, I wrote a book 10 years ago called The Shift, which predicted 2025. So I've already been stuck on that one. And what you notice when you talk to technologists about the future in 10 years' time, which I've already done, is that they will say some things they overestimate. So, for example, they would have said by 2025, we would all have driverless cars and there would be drones everywhere. Well, there are, of course, driverless cars in Palo Alto, but there probably aren't in Copenhagen and there certainly aren't in London right now. But other things they underestimate, I don't think they really estimated generative AI. I think they what they said is we'd be very virtual. Do you remember Second Life was taking off then? So they were beginning to talk about Second Life and we'd all have avatars. We actually don't. I don't have an avatar. You probably don't either. So we get some things wrong. And I think the other final thing I want to say about your question, how do you predict the future, is it's very easy to see what's going, but it's very difficult to see what's being created. So, and this has been the long history of technology, is that we find it easy to see where technology will destroy work, but we can't imagine what new jobs technology will create because those haven't been created yet and we don't even know what the needs are. So there are a whole bunch of economists who are asking that question. And one of the things they're saying is that the jobs that will be created will be jobs where humans are really at the center, and you'll pay a premium for that. You'll pay a premium for the experience of speaking to a human, having something that's made by a human, engaging in adventures or whatever that's human based. So we don't really quite get that yet, but my guess is that those are some of the jobs that are going to be flourish. Jobs that have human at the
It's fascinating, Lynda. Actually, what we can see throughout most of the world right now is that artists, concerts, tickets are more expensive than ever. And everyone wants to go for, watching a piece of, a concert or the theater. And many, many years ago, I was on the board of 3 museums. Don't ask me why, and 1 theater, but I was. And I remember we tried to figure out whether we would have more or less guests, customers. And we kind of got those numbers wrong. We thought they were declining, but they're actually increasing. So I think there's hope for humanity. Absolutely.
Yeah, that we just lean into being more human.
I like that. And also when you say, how do you spend that extra time that you get on your hand? In Silicon Valley, we have this term that people have turned themselves into ghosts. And that means that we are more pale and we look more tired because we're sitting up all night working with AI and actually monitor all our agents that are now working for us. So you would think, some do have more time at hand, but you need to really discipline yourself because I find, to be honest, it's a little addictive how much you can do with very.
Yes.
You work more. You end up working more, which is.
Well, let me give everybody a tip here, and it's this. So, as part of the book, which is also I've also written a journal and the podcast and various other things around the idea of living the 100-year life. I've made a diagnostic. It's really lovely. It's free. You'll find it on my website. You'll see it in the show notes. www.livingthe100yearlife.com. It's really, really worth doing. Only takes 15 minutes. Have a cup of coffee as you're doing it. And what that will show you is where you're spending your time. So it shows every single thread and it says, is this thread strong? Is it sort of just average, or is it fragile? And I would suggest all of you do that, because if you find that you've got fragile threads, let's say, for example, the thread of calm is fragile, and actually that's the one about 900 people have already done this survey, so we're already collecting data, and the calm is often for many people the most fragile thread. If that's the case, then you can let that thread go a little bit fragile. Imagine looking at a pattern and a weave, and you maybe see it sometimes that a thread is going really fragile, but it's still holding the fabric together. But if you let that thread break, it's going to be really hard for you to pull back the pattern again. And so my advice to everybody is, look, it's okay if there's parts of your life when some of your threads are fragile. Like, for example, you're spending all your time working on your AI and you've become a ghost. But if you do that for too long, you will impact your life. And if you want to live happily for 100 years, and I know everybody in Silicon Valley wants to live to 100 years, so that's already what you say you want to do. So my question isn't about how you do it. I think you will know how to do it. My question is what you do with those years. That's my question. What do you do with those years? And my advice is that you try and keep all of those 8 threads relatively strong.
Lynda, that reminds me of I'm half Danish, Moroccan, and American, so I have 2 citizenships. And when I'm in Silicon Valley and I talk about the Scandinavian way of living, happiness. And if we go down to the basics, let me give you an example. I have 2 children, and they grew up in Silicon Valley in the schooling system in Palo Alto, which is very, very academically superior to many other places on earth, simply because parents and teachers are super duper ambitious on behalf of the next generation. When my children get home from school, I usually ask them, did you have a great day? Did something fun happen? Did you see your friends? Are you happy? Are you doing homework again? Like, we have a whole different conversation with our children. Whilst in America, when I say that that's how we parent our children, half of them envy that almost like worry, the Scandinavian not worry lifestyle. It's more important to be happy than wealthy. On the other hand, are we really preparing our youth to all that adversity and hardship that may or may not be facing them as the work is changing? You know what I mean?
I think, look, the simplest way of describing that is that Palo Alto is a place of first and second generation people like you. And we know the research is really clear that people who leave, you're no longer living in Copenhagen, you left to go to Palo Alto, tend to be more driven, and they're very keen that their kids do well. It's the third generation, by the way, and I had worked for years with the World Economic Forum's family farm. So it was just a wonderful opportunity to look at generations. Usually by the second or third generation, they don't necessarily want to work as hard as their parents or grandparents did. And I can see that as an issue in Silicon Valley right now. But I think it's just about trying to get the balance, isn't it? I do a lot of work in Japan, and I think both Japan and South Korea, and if you think Palo Alto is tough, you want to try being a child in Japan right now, or a child. So I think there is an understanding that actually, if we're preparing people for the 100-year life, we do need to start really early. And one of the fascinating things about Japan is that the 100-year life, the first book we wrote about demography, which I wrote with Andrew Scott, became a series of manga cartoons. 3 different ones for different age groups. So for a 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-olds. And then it became a workbook for children at school. So children in Japanese schools have a workbook based on the 100-year life, which they go through and think about their future self, think about what actions they want to take and so on. So I think you're never too early to talk about what happens when you live a long life. And certainly at London Business School, I take 80 students to Tokyo every year for a week. And that's the question we're asking. It's a way of me teaching my program on the future of work, but rather than teaching it in a classroom, I teach it in Tokyo. And we talk about, here's a country that lives longer than pretty much anyone else. What does that mean? How do they think about it? We talk to companies and so on. And of course, their attitude to AI is rather different. They're very used exposed to robotics. They've been brought up with robotics. They see robotics as being really important to their lifestyle and quality and so on. So you're absolutely right. It's really fascinating. It's the marvelous thing about the WEF and the young global leaders is you come from so many countries, and that's exactly the conversations you have. When I teach my MBA students, they come from 60 nationalities. And so there's so many conversations to be had about, well, what happens in my country? Because you're absolutely right to ask yourself, where am I in all of this? And that's why, if you remember, in my new book, Living the 100-Year Life, I start with those guiding questions. And the first question is, who am I? Because if you don't know who you are, it's very difficult to know what you want. And you've already said something about your heritage. I'm sure there's a wonderful stories you could tell about leaving Copenhagen, about going to Palo Alto, about having your kids there. We all have amazing stories that we can tell about our life. And knowing those stories is really important because they do ground us in who we are. And I tell some of my stories in the book, by the way.
I know. I can't wait to read more of them, Lynda. You're very generous with your stories, which makes you a very powerful thought leader, because I couldn't stop thinking when you said amplifying and using AI. Do you remember 15 years ago, everyone was talking about personal branding as something executives should think about? Slightly different.
Yes.
And networking, strategic networking. Remember?
I do.
It's a long time ago. So I was also thinking, working into your 70s.
Yes.
You will do that. I will do that. My children will probably work well into the 80s. We don't know, but it looks like that for every generation is an additional
it's a little
decade.
Bit long.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I'm just thinking, my family has a working class background. And I can't stop thinking, working until, you're 74.
Yeah.
Sounds really tempting if you are a thought leader, a professor, or an educator. Blah, blah. What if you are let's say, factory worker or nurse?
Yes.
I'm sure you have had this question many times. What is the advice for, let's say, a nurse and she's reading your book?
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right to ask that question. And one of the reasons why countries find it difficult to think about their pension age is that exactly your point. What if you're a manual worker? It's really hard to work into your 70s if you're doing manual work, if you're plumbing, if you're, a window cleaner, even if you're a carer where you're moving people, you're physically moving people around. That's very hard. But that doesn't mean that people in those sort of occupations shouldn't be thinking about a long life. It's a gift available to all of us. And the same issues arise, which is to say, you need to think right the way through your life, what actions could I take now that would help me to keep my thread strong? So, for example, the thread of mastery. If you're a nurse right now and you're thinking, I don't think I want to be nursing forever, but maybe, in terms of mastery, you could just do a side project to see, well, what else might I be? Or in terms of friendship, you could make a friend with somebody who's doing the sort of work you think you might like to do so that you can get a sense of what they're doing. Or in terms of the thread of intimacy, you might talk to the people you love and say, look, I don't really think that this is going to work for me in the long term. What else might I do? So I think there's lots of opportunities right the way through your life to ask yourself, well, who am I? Where am I now? And what actions should I take? And let me just say a word about that. I've separated those into actions I can take now and promises to my future self. And the reason I've done that is that there are all actions that we could take now. So, for example, let's say your friendship thread is weak. And it is for lots of people who have high-powered jobs because they don't have enough time for their friends. One action is, all of us have got at least one friend. Phone them up and talk to them for 8 minutes. It's just 8 minutes. That's all it takes to reconnect. So that's one action you could take right now. But then your promises to your future self. I was talking to someone yesterday in Australia and they said, I read your book and I was thinking about the future self. So I wandered around where I was living with a friend and we looked at the houses and we said, I wonder which one we could live in when we're in our 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s. And that's the sort of thing you can do, promises to your future self. Of course, you don't know what your future self is going to be, but you could say things like, I'm very fortunate. I'm 71 and I have a friendship that goes back 60 years. It's with somebody called Shirley. If you come to my podcast, by the way, you can hear me and Shirley talking about being friends since we were 10 years old. And that's just what I say to my MBA students is that is something money can't buy. If at the age of 60, you're a billionaire and you say, I want a 60-year-old or 50-year-old friendship, the world isn't going to do that for you, however much money you've got. So those sort of investments that you make, I never thought of it as an investment, and she didn't either. We thought of it as friendship. But they do make a marvelous thing, and it's wonderful. A promise to your future self, apart from stay healthy, and we all know how to do that, is build friendships, especially across generations. And also, have adventures so that when you're in your 70s and 80s, you've got wonderful things to think about, to tell your grandchildren about.
I like that, Lynda. I like that. And congratulations on I've heard that all it takes is one good friend, ideally a few more, but
yeah,
you don't need 100 good friends.
And I wrote I have a column in the Times of London, and I wrote a nice column a couple of weeks ago where I talked about the social convoy. And what I was looking at, we were at Congregation, and I was looking at everybody getting their MBAs, sitting up at on the podium. But I wasn't really looking at the people themselves, the students. I was looking at their parents, particularly at their mums. And, I thought every single mum has got a story about their child who's now standing up, getting an MBA from all over the world. And that's the social convoy. It's the people who, they're not the same people necessarily. Some of them might be right with you right the way through, but many of them won't, but they are with you. And they're the people who help you become who you are.
True. It's true. And we sometimes need to stop and maybe reflect back and send a few thank you notes. Even, it could be to your old elementary teacher who saw you or recognized something in you, right? Yeah. I think that's something we should.
I love that idea.
Yeah. It honestly just take a few minutes and a lot of not that teachers are perfect by all means, but I think all of us have a few adults or role models throughout. It could be a soccer trainer or a ballet dance, whatever, music teacher.
You're a belly dancer. Did you just let that slip in, the belly dancer?
Why not?
Are you a belly dancer? This is the Moroccan in you.
Yeah, I wish, but
listeners, we need to see the belly dancing.
Actually, that's make me think about fun, Lynda.
Yes, adventure and fun. Have fun. Well, this is why I added the thread of adventure, actually, because when I wrote the little stories of my life, I realized I kept coming back to times when I had a lot of fun, when I'd been on an adventure, and I thought, my God, if you're going to live 100-year life, you better have fun.
Yeah.
You better have adventures, because otherwise, it's a bit dreary.
It does not cost a lot. Let me give you an example. I have a friend, and you're going to love this, Lynda. She's a big executive, and it's a very lonely job. It's a woman.
Yeah.
And she's really making tough calls every day, multiple times a day. And she shared with me that in her handbag, she always carries, you're going to love this, she always carries a little bag of confetti. And every time something succeeds for her, she just throws a little bit of confetti.
Confetti. I love it. I love it. That reminds me of my husband, who was an M&A lawyer. And he said he had a colleague who was also an M&A lawyer. And when things were really, really tough in a meeting, he'd bring out a box of digestive chocolate biscuits and say, I think it's time for a biscuit.
I think it's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, just diffuse. I do think this nurture piece is so important, and having fun and having adventures, but also being calm, which is the thread I'm afraid you young global leaders, you're going to probably have as the weakest. But we'll see. Fill in your thing and we'll see where you are on it.
I love that so much. So I'm keeping an eye on time also. So, okay, learning. I'm certain that I know your answer, but learning requires time, money, psychological safety, and maybe some, self-belief, curiosity, and all of that, right? I mean, to be a lifelong learner, and just thinking back to hybrid and online, technology is your friend, right? There's nothing you cannot learn now, right?
Yes, absolutely. When you think of all the things you're learning with Claude or, whatever, your chat GPT. Yeah, it can be your learning companion, but you also have to be, the physicality of learning is
Sure.
also really important. That's why, the next period of time when I've got a bit more time, I'm going to start going back to ceramics and making things and just getting back to my hands again, because otherwise I think for all of us and, the young global leaders, the WEF, me, you, it tends to stay up here, doesn't it? And so we have to start also. That's why I do Pilates. I did Pilates this morning, actually. That's why we have to also do things like that, which actually reconnect us with our bodies as humans. That's the marvel of being a human. I know AI thinks it's a human, but we know it's not.
Just thinking about the calmness that you said, and I agree with sport. And, even if you have absolutely no money and no space, you can almost certainly go into one yoga pose. Or when I'm traveling or busy or whatever, I have a little face moisturizer, the hot damp, and I feel I'm in a spa, but it's like a $20 something, and I put a little bit of essential oil, and I feel immediately that I'm in a very expensive spa, and I feel that energy from that.
That's good. So that you've learnt. So what we learnt when I looked at Calm, and I ran executive programs, and we noticed that Calm was the most fragile thread, said, okay, how many people have Calm as their strongest thread? And usually 3 or 4 people in the whole room put their hand up. And then I said, okay, well, tell me about how you've done it. And it came really Calm. And I wrote this up in an MIT article. Calm comes from 3 places. Some people are born calm. They've got calm personalities. Some people had calm role models in their home. They were growing up, like grandfather or grandmother or somebody. And then some people, perhaps you're one of these, actually aren't very calm. They weren't brought up in a calm family, but they decided to put calm into their lives, as you've done, just your little spa experience. And actually that turns out to be really important, because if we want to live 100-year life and we want to have personal agency, we've got to give ourselves time to reflect, time to think about those 3 questions. Who am I? Where am I now? What actions can I take now and promises to my future self? And to do that, we need space. So I actually am beginning to think that thread of calm sits at the heart of the whole weave. And if that's fragile, a lot of your other threads are going to start becoming fragile.
I think it's spot on, Lynda. I think it's spot on, because your nervous system.
Yeah.
I think with nowadays we are beginning to be able to document more. Also with the energy energy impact that are between 2 humans, and when we walk into a room. And someone told me that you have a very big radius when you walk into a room with your energy. And I think a lot of professionals nowadays, no matter if you are a nurse or a school teacher or a CEO for that matter, trust, leadership, decision-making, connections, all of that is either people get attracted to you or not, right?
Yeah.
So,
But it's interesting. I've been interviewing CEOs, as part of my job at London Business School, and there are CEOs around who are calm, and you can really feel it as they walk into the room. So it's not to say that they're, not energized. They are energized, but just the way they're behaving. So, if they're with my students, they give my students 100% attention. They're not looking at their emails. They're not scrabbling around. They're sort of focused in the moment. And I do think that we become much more productive if we do that. One of the points that you talked earlier about how we're different and we have different backgrounds and things. But one of the things we all have in common is we all have the same number of minutes every day, all of us. And we can choose to assign those in any way we want. And one of the questions I ask my MBA students to think about is, if you think about the last day and you think about those 8 threads, where did you assign your time? And it's, that's a really sort of fascinating question, because unless they've assigned some time into calm. The other question I then ask is, as you look at what you did spend your time doing, how much was that actually useful? How much did that actually help you? So if you spent an hour scrolling, which thread would you assign that to?
hopefully fun or education maybe, but definitely not time wasting. I don't think that would be a good one.
Yeah.
Lynda, thank you so much for your time. It's been, as always, a pleasure listening to you and staying inspired by how you keep pushing yourself in the best possible way. Congratulations on your new book, Living the 100 Years Life. It's a must read for everyone. I totally agree. A must read. So everyone listening to this, please jump in, get yourself a copy, write a recommendation. It actually does matter a great deal for any authors. Yes. So please do that.
The diagnostic and listen to the podcast.
And listen to the podcast. It's in the show notes. Lynda, thank you so much for spending your time with us and enjoy France. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.